Welcome everyone to NGW's In a Nutshell podcast, which takes stock of the most important developments shaping the global gas industry. I'm happy to be joined once more by Thierry Bros, a professor at Sciences Po Paris, and Anne-Sophie Corbeau, a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Today we'll be taking stock of the latest developments in the European energy crisis saga. Hi guys, thanks for being here. Since we last spoke in November, what are the key developments that have taken place? How has the mood in the European gas market shifted? Prices, of course, are, for one thing, certainly a lot more comfortable, although they're still very high if this was a typical year. Let's start off with, what has driven that sharp decline. Anne-Sophie, would you like to start off?
Well, I think we can thank the weather, the relatively mild weather that we have had since the 19th of December for that. Definitely, we had about 4 weeks of exceptionally mild weather. And if you remember correctly, the first weeks of December were pretty cold, and we had started seeing storage levels going down. But then what happened at the very end is that because of the mild weather, the storage levels stabilized, and we started seeing at the very same time gas prices coming down. They were at about 130, 140 euro per megawatt hour before, and then they started coming down, and now we have been around 50 euro per megawatt hour. As you say, this is still much higher than the 20 to 30 that we have been used to in the past, but this is significantly much lower than we have seen otherwise in the past year. I also note that European gas demand also remains relatively low because we have seen also much lower gas demand in the industrial sector. I think also there have been some significant efforts being made in the residential sector. Power generation is a little bit more complicated. We can talk about that. And we are continuing to see relatively healthy LNG supply coming to Europe.
Thierry, anything to add?
Yes, I think as Anne-Sophie stated very clearly, I mean, we were saved by the weather. I think traders have done a great job. I mean, if we go back to what happened in 2022, we've been in a position to replace all the Russian pipe gas missing by something different. As Anne-Sophie stated, there's been some demand reduction, but there's also been massive rerouting of US LNGs that helped us. There've been a bit more Norwegian gas flowing into Europe at the expense, by the way, of Norwegian oil. The Norwegians have decided to help us, and so therefore to reduce their oil to be in a position to increase their gas production. And I think we should thank them as allies for this. And at the end of the day, because of this mild weather, we have storage that are completely full at record level as we speak for the season. And so therefore we can say that the crisis is postponed. For me, it's not over, it's postponed. I mean, we were lucky. And then the next question is, what are the next steps? Perhaps I'll add one thing to what Anne-Sophie was mentioning. The market has done the job. Policymakers, I would question. I mean, so far, they've put 800 billion euros to help European citizen and industry to cope with extreme high prices. But at the end of the day, the EU Green Deal dogma is still there. And as you've seen, we've signed very little new gas contract. We've launched no new facilities, etc., etc. So the crisis isn't over, unfortunately.
Well, my next question was going to be on policy. Is it just the high prices which are causing this steep reduction in demand, or can you attribute any of that decline to policy incentives?
I think, we have seen a lot of different things happening. So in the industrial sector, it's pretty clear that industrials are reducing their gas consumption, either because this is no longer competitive for them to actually produce. I mean, if you are exposed to the international market and your gas prices are much higher, and especially if your gas price is an important component of your final product cost, then you are really at a disadvantage. And this is why we have seen, for example, fertilizer producers reducing their consumption drastically. In the residential sector, I mean, there have been also, it's simply the fact that gas prices for residential consumers, despite the help, has also increased. But I have to say, I mean, the things that Germany did with their gas price bremse was particularly interesting. So they said to their consumers, okay, I am going to sort of cap the price or keep the price fixed for the first 80% of your historical gas consumption. Anything above that, you will pay the market price.
Mhm.
So it's a way to protect the consumer while at the same time incentivize a gas demand reduction, because the additional gas, everything which is above the 80%, is going to be more expensive. What we have not solved, however, and this is where the European Commission was coming with, we are going to incentivize a lot more wind, a lot more solar, etc. Yes, we have seen in 2022 that the capacity installed has been higher, but definitely not at the level which is required, especially for wind, to reach the 2030 target. And this is also something that the IEA has recently observed when they were looking at the numbers. But the biggest problem for the power sector, and the reason why we have actually not really decreased our gas consumption, is because we have not had enough nuclear and we have not had enough hydro. And this is really crucial to understand that the loss of these two components was about 180 terawatt hours. The power consumption in Europe roughly is about, or was about, 3,000 terawatt hours. So this is a substantial number.
And are we seeing an improvement in the French nuclear output? What's the outlook there? Is it set to, are we going to have fewer outages in this year?
So there are two problems. The first one is that a certain number of these plants are going through their 10-year inspection, especially there are some who are 40 years old, and you need to go through a very thorough inspection, which lasts 6 months. So this is very serious because we are talking about safety here. Nobody wants to have a nuclear incident in France. So there is that, and this is going to continue to impact our nuclear power plant for the next few years, which is why EDF, when they are doing or making some forecast about nuclear generation over the next few years, are not saying that we are going to go back to the roughly 400 terawatt hours that we were observing in the past decade before a few years. What they can try to solve is the corrosion issue. So that was about 30 to 40 terawatt hour. I think we are slowly getting there. But that was something completely unexpected, and which is a result of decisions taken by engineers something like 30 years ago. So something which was totally unforeseeable.
I see. Thierry, so you can give me a precise answer, but as I understand, so Russian pipeline gas supply to Europe is now at something around 10-15% of the pre-war level. I might be wrong there, but anyway, has Russia lost this energy war, at least when it comes to gas?
Yes, just perhaps a comment, an added comment on the first question from Anne-Sophie. I think what we've seen back in 2022 was the market was screaming there was a problem, and we had prices that were uncompetitive in any way. I mean, if we looked at prices at the end of last summer, the whole industry should have stopped. And it changed, in fact, when finally policymakers realized there was a problem. Because again, I mean, we are in year 3 of this energy crisis, but the first 2 years, there was people in Brussels not recognizing this. And I think for me, the statement of the recognition of policymakers in Brussels was the council regulation on the 5th of August stating we need to reduce our gas demand by 15%, because this was the idea behind being in a position later to put an embargo on Russian gas. And then I go back to your question about how much gas do we receive. So if you look at Russian pipe gas today, in January, we received something like 1.7 BCM for the month of January versus something that used to be 14 BCM for normal months prior to the weaponization of gas. So my call here is that we will continue to receive a little bit of Russian gas going forward, because I don't think Vladimir Putin has an incentive to fully cut Russian gas, because this will be, I will label this the nuclear option. For two reasons. First of all, a little bit of gas still provides some disunion inside the European Union, because Gazprom may be in a position to push this little bit of gas to the least unfriendly countries, i.e. Hungary from Viktor Orban. First of all, it also allows Russia to say to others behind closed door, well, if you want more gas, we can. And again, if you look at the capacity Russia has to provide more gas in Europe at no changes, it's more or less something like 4.5 BCM per month, i.e. full Turk Stream plus the contracted in Ukraine. So there is this room for maneuver in Russia. And then to fully answer your question, I think we need to think about what's going to be after the war. Are we going to see any Russian gas coming into Europe? And how are we going, if we win the war, how are we going to look into this and to regulate this? Because now we've understood there could be weaponization of gas. We've seen this in 2021, in 2022. And so if we want some Russian gas going forward in the mix, we have to make this immune to weaponization.
And what possible outcomes? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, maybe I can add to that, because I mean, we have just published at Columbia a report looking at the future options for Russian gas exports. And what we found out is that, of course, it depends very much on the state of geopolitics. So, where are we in the conflict with Russia? Are we in a situation where everything has deteriorated? And there is a possibility that we could no longer receive pipeline gas, but also Russian LNG, which is still coming to Europe. But, looking also in 7 years from now, by 2030, there is also the possibility that, we could have some sort of peace agreement. I mean, there might be a regime change in Russia. There might be, people with whom we can discuss. What is sure is that, we have to consider two things. The first one is how much infrastructure would be available to supply Europe, and in particular in terms of pipelines, because Nord Stream 1 has been damaged, and we don't know to what extent, it can be repaired and how to do that exactly. Nord Stream 2 has been also partially damaged. There is still apparently one string which will be operational. But we still have capacity for Ukraine, although that would be a very interesting discussion to basically go back to even the contractual level of 40 billion cubic meters that Thierry was mentioning. We have also a pipeline which is going through Belarus and arriving to Poland, which is intact, but because Russia doesn't want to use that pipeline, it's not used right now. So there is a capacity to at least go to easily, anywhere between 70 and even much higher levels. However, there is a question, do we want to go back to high levels of Russian gas? And I don't think we want. So there will be a need to regulate a little bit like Spain has been doing with Algeria. In the Spanish law and regulation, they basically cap the percentage of Algerian gas that they are receiving. So you could imagine something like that being done at an EU level for all countries. Anybody, you do not take more than, 10% of your imports coming from Russia, and maybe they can be, some different percentages, because of course you need to take into account the reality of the infrastructure. But we are never going to go back to the levels we were before, and also because it's very likely that our gas demand, meanwhile, is going to drop because of all the action which is done on energy efficiency, on the increase in terms of wind and solar, etc., and the electrification and the increase in hydrogen.
Go ahead.
Perhaps I'd like to add, Joe. I mean, I've published something early January in Natural Gas World, and that seems to have some traction on the diplomatic level. I mean, if there is a peace agreement, and I take the if of Anne-Sophie, then there will also be this question about repayment. Who pays for what? And you're hearing people in Brussels and different capitals saying Russia must pay, which maybe is possible as long as there is a peace agreement and we win the war, which is two big ifs. But then the question, if we want Russia to pay, Russia can only pay with gas. That's a very simple element. So we may end up with something like what we've seen back in Iraq with the oil for food from Saddam Hussein program. And I think we have to be very realistic, as Anne-Sophie was mentioning. We have to make sure that there won't be any weaponization of gas. And the way I did the math was to say, well, if we look at how much electricity is produced from coal in Europe, because at the end of the day, we still have to go through our climate targets. And so the first climate target should be to remove coal and replace it by gas, and then replace this gas by renewable, which is what our dear friend, the British, have done back since 2018. Just to give you a broad number, if we were to replace today all the electricity produced by coal by electricity produced by gas, we will need 90 BCM of extra gas in Europe. And this is what I'm saying. So I agree with Anne-Sophie, it cannot be back to the big numbers, but I'm saying let's go for 80 BCM, so i.e. the full replacement of coal. And my view here is, well, it could be done in a system where we are saying to the Russian, this gas goes to replace our coal. This is going to be in dedicated countries. I have in the article, people can access it, I have in the article a way to make sure that there is no mismanagement on Russia's side on market prices. So I price it at complete different level than anything that is market price in Europe. And then I'm saying to all member states, well, if you want, you use the joint EU purchase mechanism. We agglomerate all those volumes, and then we reach up to 80 BCM max, or 65 if we don't go through Turkey. I'm not a big fan of Belarus, Anne-Sophie, because Belarus is owned by Gazprom anyway, so they could do it. But after Belarus comes Poland, and I believe Poland will make it extremely impossible for Russian gas to transit via Poland, as Poland doesn't need any Russian gas any longer. And if you do this, so if you take those 65 BCM per year, then you can say that we Europeans pay to Gazprom a cost plus of the gas, and then we put the rent of the gas into an escrow account for Ukraine. And in the next 10 years, we could be in a position of having repaid more or less the GDP of Ukraine, the annual GDP of Ukraine.
Sophie?
Add that, I mean, while I can agree that, transiting through Belarus and arriving to Poland might be difficult, the negotiations with Ukraine have also been in the past particularly complicated. If you remember the negotiation of the so-called current contract, back before 2019 was also not an easy thing to do. So, there is no easy thing. Actually, the easiest would be maybe to use the undamaged Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But again, because this is Nord Stream 2, it might be also, from the German point of view, a political hot potato that they don't want to deal with.
Well, they could always
and with you. And with Ukraine, the Ukraine get the transit fee as they continue. It's 2-point-something billion euro in my spreadsheet. So it helps also stabilizing the Ukrainian Russia flows and relation in gas. But difficult, I agree.
Especially considering that they will be asking for, a kind of repayment. I mean, Ukraine has been large parts of Ukraine have been destroyed. So, beyond the energy sphere, there is also the whole question on how, if Russia loses a war, how they are going to repay for the damages that they have done in Ukraine.
There has been some discussion in Moscow about expanding the Turk Stream. That falls under this Turkish gas hub proposal, which both Putin and Erdogan have drummed up as an option. What are your thoughts on that, Thierry?
Well, I think that's not in the interest of Europe. I mean, again, if we want to have this repayment, I mean, it needs to be a complete transparent process. And the easiest way for us to have a transparent process will be, as I stated, to put an escrow account and to deliver the money directly to Ukraine. I mean, it can work with the actual capacity in the Turk Stream that is dedicated to Europe. I don't think in peace or whatever an agreement there will be this increase in the capacity of the Turk Stream, because this will make system more difficult to. And again, when we remember what we are looking at, sanction or programs for this. The problem is the gray zone. The problem is what's evading the sanction, what's evading what's going outside. So, I mean, having a few dedicated line is much easier than having one new line being created just for this process.
Okay, and looking at the short term, another development, Freeport LNG is starting up again, tentatively. How much of a contribution is that going to make to the European market? I mean, that terminal was obviously it sold a lot of gas to Europe prior to its shutdown. Anne-Sophie?
Well, I see that as a good news for global LNG market in general. It's going to be another 20 billion cubic meters, so this is quite significant. The global LNG trade right now is about 540 BCM, so anything that we can add in terms of supply is absolutely welcome. And we should not forget that, we have taken quite a bit of natural gas or LNG away from Asia. This Asian demand might restart at some point. We are seeing some signs again from China, for example. So I think, anything which can contribute to lower the global LNG price and contribute to increased supply is welcome. I also thought that, unfortunately, over the next 2 years, I mean, there is going to be relatively little additional LNG capacity coming to the market. The LNG plants that are starting operating this year are relatively small, whether we are talking about, for example, Tangour, whether we are talking about Senegal and Mauritania. So the big one that should have started is Arctic LNG 2, but there is a question mark on whether this is going to start or not, on time or not. How much is it going to be one train? Are we going to see the next trains next year and then in 2026? There are a lot of question marks on that. And this is contributing to the tightness of the global LNG market over the next few years. However, where there is a question mark is that, in my experience, looking at LNG projects over the past 20 years, project sponsors are always extremely optimistic about the starting date. They always tell you, don't worry, it's going to start by then, we are on time, etc. That would be extremely good news if some LNG plants which have said that they are going to start in 2024 indeed are starting in 2024, because that would basically bring more LNG supply and contribute to lowering the tightness on global LNG markets.
Okay, and yeah, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about Arctic LNG too. The Russian side seems to keep on saying that it's on schedule, but certainly a lot of uncertainty. Another thing I came across the other day, a proposal in Germany by Germany's government to look at restricting Russian LNG imports. I assume you're going to tell me that's a bad idea, but do you think that proposal might make progress? Is it something that Germany or others might adopt in the future?
Well, I mean, first of all, there is still quite a bit of Russian LNG which is coming to Europe, also because it makes sense for them from an economic point of view to target the market, which, for a large part of 2022 was at a premium. So when you look at, where Yamal LNG is and the netback that they can get by selling to Europe, it's economics 101. It does make sense. Now, to the proposal of Germany, it really depends whether we are restricting LNG exports from Russia, which I would say is a very bad idea because it's about 40 billion cubic meters overall, and we need that LNG for the global LNG market. Now, if they are saying we don't want that LNG to come to Europe, including the United Kingdom, which, by the way, doesn't want to have Russian LNG anymore, and this since 2022, then this is a different question. We are going to see the same thing happening as we see on the oil markets, which is the LNG from Russia is just going to go somewhere else. It's going to make things much more complicated, however. This is the only problem because during winter, when the Russian LNG from the Yamal Peninsula cannot go through the northern route, it would have to go all the way through the Suez Canal, etc., to reach Asia. So this is going to maybe contribute to a little bit more tightness of the global LNG market.
Yes, but perhaps I'll add one thing. I mean, Russia LNG is increased security of supply for us, we like it or not. And interestingly enough, I mean, remember the northern route, as Anne-Sophie stated, is closed in winter. And so therefore they have to come in Europe. And interestingly enough, the reloaded has been limited because we don't have those slots available. So in fact, if we look at the world, yes, in winter when there is a normal winter, i.e., no zero COVID policy in China. China takes most of the LNG, but we take the Russian LNG. So interfering in this system may again be counterproductive at the European level. We may like it or not. That's another story. But I think we have to look at the geography here, as Anne-Sophie stated, and the northern route is not open all year long, and so therefore we, quote unquote, benefit from a Russian LNG in plain winter.
Do you think anything similar to the price caps on Russian oil, petroleum and products might be considered for Russian LNG in the future?
If you remember the whole saga of price caps, which has happened since basically, I think, the European Council mentioning that in May 2022, one of the proposals was we are going to price to put a cap on the price of Russian gas and LNG. And I think, the answer from the Russian authorities was pretty clear. Well, then in that case, you are no longer going to get any Russian gas, period. So if we were to do that, I would say that, the 20 BCM or so that we are still getting in terms of pipeline gas from Russia might disappear. And on top of that, yes, the LNG would be redirected somewhere else. But I'm not even sure that actually people would, the price cap would actually work, period.
Yes, I'm very dubious of those elements for many reasons. I mean, we can look at the price cap at the TTF, and again, I think the best outcome has been that the ICE is now opening a TTF traded in the UK to avoid the cap. So it shows you that the market doesn't like this and is not going. And so we've shot ourselves in the foot again on this one. But if I go to price cap for others, because this is a bit of a very colonialist view, saying, well, we don't want this, but you'll have to pay it at this price cap. I think we are making the fortune of China and India at the end of the day. They can buy oil at a cap, diesel, petrol at a cap. I mean, we should look at, sanctions should be designed in a way to hurt Russia more than us, but not as helping the Chinese. We are giving the Chinese the benefit of having low energy prices on top of what they have already, which is a low labor. And if I may, I'll add something which is in the oil business. I think we are making a big mistake by putting a price cap on diesel. I think this is not going to have the impact we think. And again, by having an embargo on diesel, we are in fact creating massive increase in refining margin in Europe, which is at the contrary, which is going to hurt us. I mean, it's going to benefit the few companies that are doing this, but this I would call this a profit of war. And I think the Commission and member states should look at this much more than trying to set international prices in a way where, remember, we are market economies. I think it's forgotten sometimes in Europe or even in Washington, D.C. We are market economies.
Mm-hmm. Well, the TTF gas price cap was introduced this month. If I'm correct, it wouldn't have been triggered. The conditions are so difficult to meet that it wouldn't have been triggered at any point last year, even when you had that late August spike. Or am I wrong?
No, actually, so the first proposal would not have been triggered. You may remember that they were proposing
yes.
275 euro per megawatt hour.
Yeah.
Now, if you are looking at the ESSER report that they published in early January 2023, you can see that, in fact, it would have been triggered from basically a period from the end of July 2022 to roughly the end of September, because the conditions are much different than what was proposed a month before. We ended up with so two conditions. The fact that the TTF front month is at 180 euro per megawatt hours for 3 consecutive working days, and that at the same time there is a difference with the EU reference price, which is in fact the price that ESSER is publishing now based on a basket of LNG import, and it has to be 35 euro per megawatt hour or more than 35 euro per megawatt hour higher. So if these two conditions are met, then this is when the price cap is triggered.
But at the time we didn't have this LNG index, perhaps it would have been slightly different. Again, and the LNG index from ACER is a bit of something that is out of the blue and perhaps not so resilient as an index going forward.
Okay,
yeah,
well,
funny enough.
Go ahead.
Funny enough, I mean, the European Commission has been literally obsessed, with this index on LNG, and they have been also obsessed about the fact that there was this gap between TTF and, for example, the S&P Northwestern European LNG Index. And hence, this affirmation that the market is broken, TTF is no longer representative. And, this is why we are getting now all these attempts to, move away from TTF, which, I mean, TTF, the market is working. I mean, what TTF was just saying is that we have been removing, or there is not enough Russian gas supply coming to Northwest Europe, but the capacity to replace that missing Russian gas supply is actually not available. We have not enough LNG regasification capacity in Northwest Europe. Now it's changing. And at a certain point in time, the gap between, the so-called Northwest European LNG price and TTF is going to shrink. Well, it has already, but if we were in the same condition as before, it would have shrunk anyway because we are adding LNG regasification capacity. Of course, now the situation is totally different. TTF prices have come down, the European reference price as well. So we are in a totally different situation.
And if I may, TTF was a great achievement of past Commission and the Dutch government. I mean, remember back prior to Brexit, we were all talking in NBP, in pence per therm. So, I mean, we've successfully in Europe managed to have one commodity traded in euro, which is the gas. And now this Commission is trying to fiddle with the market. So I think this is why I'm always very worried when people are trying to fiddle with the market, because at the end of the day, we are pushing for other indexes, as we've seen with ICE opening a counter index.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks to both of you for a very interesting discussion. Any closing remarks? Anne-Sophie?
Well, I think, despite the relatively good news that the gas prices have come down, the market remains very tight. So we should be extremely careful. We need to continue in the good direction, which is try to basically reduce our gas consumption to the maximum, but at the same time being very mindful that we don't want to damage our industrial sector too much. I think the industrial sector is suffering from the high energy prices. There is also something which is worth looking at and keeping an eye on, which is the reform of the power market design, which is also going to keep us quite busy. I know for us gas people, this is a little bit on the side, but I think this is going to have some implications for the gas market as well.
Yeah, yes, and I'd like to finish with the electricity market reform. I think it's something the Commission should have thought before, because if we go back to 2019, when Ursula von der Leyen took the lead position, she came with a Green Deal, and in the Green Deal was the idea that CO2 prices would have to go up. This was embedded in the Green Deal. And I've been saying this since 2019. I mean, if you have this Green Deal and you do not reform the electricity market, which was a choice at the time, then you're going to end up with greenflation, i.e. the electricity price was bound to increase, whatever the gas price was going to do, whatever the coal price, whatever was going to do. And in fact, again, we woke up by this weaponization of gas. But the problem of electricity being indexed to the price of CO2 at the end of the day is important in a world where we want to be greener. And I think it's important for gas people, but I think it's important for the world to watch this, because if we back many years ago when we stated how was going to be traded commodities, be it oil, be it gas, be it electricity, the marginal was setting the price. In electricity, the marginal is something which is a market electron that has some CO2 element, and some electrons have no CO2 carbon footprint. And so therefore, the pricing of this should be completely different. And I think this is an extremely important element. I hope the Commission gets it right, because this will be perhaps a reform that's going to be watched all over the world, because this is important. How do we manage to go greener without having this green inflation on some elements that are not needed? I mean, why should we have solar electricity being priced at the cost of gas plus CO2 if we're using gas? So I think that's an extremely important element. The Commission is supposed to release this in March. We will see if this Commission is able to do this in its tenure, but I hope they will, because I think it's an emergency situation right now.
Mm-hmm. So key headlines are energy crisis isn't over yet, and important to watch out for that power market reform. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. This has been NGW's In a Nutshell podcast. Thank you, and see you next time.